Welcome to the deep dive. Today, well, we're immersing ourselves in really one of the most astonishing political transformations in the modern Middle East.
We are. We're looking at Abdullah Öcalan's ideological evolution.
Yeah, going beneath the surface, using scholarly literature on what's called the Kurdish paradox of statelessness.
And our mission here, it's pretty straightforward, but also quite profound. We want to meticulously map the ideological shift Öcalan underwent. You know, he founded the PKK. He was its chief theoretician.
Right.
And this shift happens after his capture in 1999. We're aiming to unpack some really deep contradictions in his concepts like Democratic Confederalism and also Turkileşme.
Turkification.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
A shift that fundamentally redefines the whole Kurdish struggle.
Okay, so before we get into those contradictions, let's set the stage a bit. Öcalan founded the PKK way back in 1978.
That's right. In northern Kurdistan, which is under Turkish rule.
And for 2 decades, he was just the undisputed leader, charismatic figure. They called him Under.
A title with a lot of weight in Turkey, usually reserved for Ataturk.
Right. And he was, back then, a revolutionary, steeped in Marxist-Leninist thought, fighting for an independent, united Kurdistan. That was the goal.
But that whole trajectory, I mean, it just slams into a wall between 1998 and 1999.
What happened?
Well, there was intense pressure from Turkey on Syria, where Öcalan was based. Diplomatic, military pressure.
Okay.
So Syria expelled him. He then spent about 3 pretty harrowing months trying to get asylum in Europe.
That must have been intense.
Absolutely. Before he was finally captured and extradited to Turkey in February '99. And the report suggests, the U.S. and Israel provided intelligence help for that capture.
And this capture, this seems to be the absolute turning point, the point of no return, really.
It is.
Because during his trial, which was huge, very publicized, this revolutionary leader, the face of armed struggle for decades, he makes this stunning declaration. He offers his services to the Turkish state.
It's unbelievable when you think about it.
Was it just rhetoric, like trying to survive?
That's what some might think, but the sources suggest it wasn't just survival rhetoric. It really kicked off a radical strategic pivot. And this unfolded over the next decade, moving him far, far away from his Marxist separatist roots.
So post-99, what does this pivot look like?
Well, he starts embracing concepts like ileri democracy, that's progressive democracy. Then later in the 2000s, he quite unexpectedly adopts traditional Islamic views.
Islamic views from a Marxist background.
Yeah, but maybe most critically, he begins this profound revision of how the 1920 Turkish National Pact, the Misak-ı Milli, should be interpreted.
Wow.
Essentially aligning his movement, or what it became, with a historical Turkish geopolitical goal. It's just an ideological U-turn of, well, astronomical proportions.
It really sounds like the person who went into prison in 99 is almost a completely different political thinker from the one writing after, say, 2005.
You could certainly argue that.
Okay, so let's dig into the new framework then. Democratic Confederalism. This gets embodied in the Kurdistan Communities Union, the KCK, founded in 2005.
Right. And the KCK's stated framework, I mean, on paper, it looks quite progressive. It talks about democratic confederalism, direct democracy, gender equality, ecological sustainability.
All things that sound appealing, very modern.
Exactly. These are the principles that have influenced governance models, like most famously Rojava in Syrian Kurdistan. That's the surface layer.
But you're saying there's more to it. The sources reveal a paradox, particularly around statehood.
A foundational paradox, yes. Öcalan's new doctrine claims to challenge the hierarchical, often oppressive, nation-state model.
Which was the original enemy, in a way.
Precisely. But the critique, and it's a strong one, is that this challenge is really only theoretical. In practice, it very carefully avoids dismantling or even questioning the unitary structures of the non-Kurdish nation-states. Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria, their fundamental structures are left untouched.
So it's challenging the idea of a nation-state, but not the actual states Kurds live in.
It's like the ultimate political hedge. Öcalan himself explicitly stated that advocating for a completely stateless democracy, right now at least, is adventurism. He thinks it's unrealistic.
Okay.
And here's the really critical bit, the conceptual shift. He defines the KCK solution not as an antithesis to the unitary state model.
Which you'd expect.
Right. But as a parallel and complementary civil society entity, something that emerges alongside the state.
Wait, complementary. How can a revolutionary alternative be complementary to the system it's supposed to be replacing or fighting against? That doesn't quite track.
It doesn't, does it?
Yeah.
If you're truly anti-state, you don't complement the existing state. You replace it or you fundamentally alter it.
So what does this compromise actually involve on the ground?
Well, it involves fully legitimizing the existing Turkish unitary state. He was incredibly clear about this in his writings. He stated, and I'm quoting loosely here from the analysis, something like, "The institutions and existing borders of the Republic of Turkey are considered legitimate."
He said that.
Yes. And further, issues such as the form of state, whether it be unitary, federal, or confederal, are not discussed, and it is not even recommended to bring them up.
Wow. That's an immense concession, strategically huge.
It is.
It basically takes Kurdish federalism, let alone independence, completely off the table. It validates the very framework, the unitary Turkish state that has historically marginalized Kurds.
Exactly that. And if you look inside the KCK at its internal workings, the paradox just gets deeper.
How so?
Well, while it claims to champion this radical bottom-up democracy, the structure itself described in the sources is deeply centralized, authoritarian even, and it all revolves around him, around Öcalan.
How is that laid out? Is it in their foundational documents?
Yes, the KCK's social pact apparently outlines his role very clearly. It mandates that Öcalan represents the leadership institution that represents all people in every field.
Represents all people in every field.
And serves as the last decision-making body on fundamental issues.
That doesn't sound very grassroots or radically democratic. That sounds more like a supreme leader model.
It certainly leans that way, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Very similar to the centralized structures in the states he supposedly opposes.
And what about the people, the citizens within this KCK framework? What are their duties?
Well, the sources note that the civic duties defined for KCK citizens are surprisingly restrictive. They are obliged to resist oppression and exploitation, okay? But they must also adhere to the ethics of a free and democratic society.
Obliged to adhere to ethics. Who defines those ethics?
Exactly. That's the Pusin critique. Who defines them? And since they are mandatory, apparently enforced without any popular vote or mechanism for dissent,
Right.
scholars analyzing this suggest this obligatory ethical code, enforced by a central leadership, starts to look a lot like totalitarian moral policing. It's like radical democracy, but only if you conform unquestioningly.
So an internal structure that's potentially authoritarian, centralized around him, which I suppose allows him to make these huge geopolitical shifts.
It certainly concentrates decision-making power.
Which brings us to maybe the most astonishing pivot, the revival of Misak-ı Milli. Can you give us the background on that? What is the Turkish National Pact?
Sure. So Misak-ı Milli was absolutely foundational for modern Turkey. It dates back to 1920, declared by the last Ottoman Parliament. It basically defined the non-negotiable territories the emerging Turkish state claimed, based on Muslim-majority population.
Okay.
And crucially, this included areas well outside Turkey's current borders, specifically southern Kurdistan, think Mosul, Kirkuk in modern Iraq, and parts of western Kurdistan in northern Syria around Aleppo.
So it's fundamentally a document rooted in, well, historical Turkish expansionism or nationalism.
You could definitely frame it that way.
Why on earth would the leader of a Kurdish liberation movement endorse this specific Turkish nationalist agenda? It seems utterly contradictory.
It does. And he doesn't just endorse it. The analysis shows he actually revises history to defend it. Öcalan claims, falsely according to historical consensus, that those 1920 borders were established on the unity of Kurds and Turks as fraternal nations.
Fraternal nations.
Yeah. He then frames the subsequent fragmentation of those territories, which happened with the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, as a tragedy primarily for the Kurds. He argues it harmed Kurds more than Turks.
So he's flipping the narrative. Instead of Kurds being victims of Turkish nationalism, they were partners in a grand vision that got tragically broken up.
That's the essence of his revisionism, painting Kurds as the wronged party in a sort of millennial brotherhood pact with the Turks.
In this historical revisionism, it must have a purpose now, a modern political goal.
Yeah, absolutely. Öcalan explicitly connects the KCK and Democratic Confederalism to reviving Misak-ı Milli. He states his plan aims to reintegrate southern and western Kurdistan, those areas in Iraq and Syria, into the Turkish sphere of influence.
Reintegrate them into Turkey's sphere.
Yes. He actually says, according to the sources, when we mention the Middle East Confederation, it is about reviving this situation, meaning the Misak-ı Milli borders.
This is just a remarkable geopolitical calculation he's making from prison. He's essentially signaling to Ankara, to the Turkish state, look, my movement, the KCK, isn't your enemy. We can actually be your partner in achieving your historical regional goals.
That appears to be exactly the strategic message. Its communication aims squarely at the Turkish state, suggesting Öcalan's project is designed to prevent the spread of independent Kurdish federalism.
Like the kind seen in Iraqi Kurdistan.
Precisely. He seems to be positioning the KCK as the most favorable choice for Turkey, a way to counter genuine separatist movements that seek formal statehood or federal recognition outside of Ankara's ultimate control.
So instead of being the premier nationalist threat to Turkey, he's offering his movement as a strategic tool, a way for Turkey to manage Kurdish politics and potentially expand its influence by co-opting that energy.
That's the interpretation presented in the analysis, yeah.
This political maneuvering, then, it must lead to concessions on Kurdish identity itself. Which brings us to this term, Turkilesme.
Right. Historically, the Turkish state pushed Turkilesme forced ethnic Turkification, assimilation. Turkilesme, or Turkelification, which Öcalan advocates, is presented as different. The emphasis is supposedly on loyalty to the Turkish state and identification with the broader civic nation of Turkey rather than ethnicity.
But legally, does that distinction even hold up, given the Turkish constitution?
Well, critics argue it's almost meaningless in practice, because Öcalan legitimizes the Turkish constitution, and that constitution famously declares everyone bound to the Turkish state through the bond of citizenship is a Turk. So, by accepting this, he's accepting the constitutional denial of any distinct non-Turkish collective identity. Turkilesme just looks like assimilation made voluntary or perhaps self-enforced rather than state-coerced.
Okay, let's talk about language. Surely language, the bedrock of identity, must be central if he's fighting for cultural rights within any democratic structure.
You would think so. But this is where the analysis points to perhaps the most devastating contradiction.
Go on.
Öcalan, in his post-99 writings, consistently minimized the importance of the Kurdish language. He actively opposed its official status.
Opposed it?
Yes. He reportedly referred to the officialization of Kurdish as a danger or a threat.
A danger. The leader of the biggest Kurdish movement sees making Kurdish official as a danger. That's shocking.
It is deeply shocking, and apparently he went even further, stating he was not even willing to discuss Kurdish language education at the state level.
Not willing to discuss it.
He classified Kurdish not as a national language needing state protection and promotion, but merely as a local language, a Yerel Dil, or just a mother tongue.
And by doing that, by calling it just a local language.
He effectively pushes all responsibility for its survival onto NGOs, onto community groups, individuals. He aligns perfectly with the state narrative of denial, where the state refuses institutional support, which often leads toward linguicide.
And does this contradict his own earlier views?
Starkly. The sources point out that in his earlier, more radical writings, Öcalan himself was keenly aware of how the official language of a state makes local languages obsolete, how it threatens their survival and leads to losses for its users.
So he knew the stakes.
He articulated the stakes perfectly, but his later writings completely dismissed that understanding, dismissed the devastating impact of linguistic assimilation that he once recognized.
This level of alignment with the state's position, even on something as fundamental as language, it really does suggest a profound psychological shift might have occurred.
It does, and this leads into the critique that Öcalan's later views reflect a deeply colonialized mentality. The term used is colonimentalism.
Colonimentalism, the idea that the oppressed group starts to internalize the colonizer's negative assessment of them.
Precisely, that they see themselves through the colonizer's eyes, often critically.
And this shows up in how he actually describes Kurds.
Yes, quite disturbingly. In his later writings, he uses incredibly dehumanizing terms for Kurds. He claimed they were so betrayed, so broken, that, and this is a paraphrase of this source's quote, neither human nor animal laws apply to them. They almost played the role of a third kind of being.
A third kind of being? That's incredibly harsh.
It is. And his stated mission, then, isn't framed as liberation from the state, but as rescuing Kurds from this pathological condition he calls Kurdishness.
Wow. That sounds like the ultimate internalized oppression. The idea that the group itself is the problem and needs saving by a leader who will guide them back into the fold of the dominant power, almost self-annihilating politically.
It's presented as the ultimate psychological submission in this analysis. This whole pivot reinforces a subjugated political position for Kurds. It ensures their future remains entirely within the political and geopolitical boundaries set by the Turkish state, actively preventing the emergence of genuine sovereignty or even meaningful federalism.
Okay, let's try to bring these threads together then. To summarize the core contradiction, we've really spent this deep dive exploring.
Hmm.
Öcalan's post-1999 ideology, this Democratic Confederalism project, it isn't genuinely anti-nation state, is it?
Not in the way it engages with existing states, no.
It seems more like a really complex strategic maneuver. One designed to, first, legitimize the unitary Turkish state structure. Second, align with Turkish expansionist goals, this revival of Misak Milli.
Right.
And third, simultaneously demand that Kurds accept a kind of reduced non-national identity, to surrender their distinct linguistic and political aspirations for genuine self-determination.
That captures the core argument of the critique well. The study essentially concludes that this entire project simplifies the Kurdish question, reduces it down to maybe a sociological phenomenon, something that should just naturally assimilate or perhaps be utilized for the benefit of the larger Turkish nation. It effectively neutralizes the potential for real national conflict from Ankara's perspective.
It's an analysis that just completely reframes decades of struggle, decades rooted in liberation. Which, I guess, brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over.
Okay.
Despite all those years of struggle, explicitly for national liberation, Öcalan's later writings include this personal testament. He apparently said that the flag of the Turkish unitary state can be hoisted on my grave.
Yeah. So, considering everything we've discussed, the contradictions, the denial of language rights, the acceptance of the unitary state, even endorsing Turkish geopolitical ambitions, what does it actually mean for a liberation movement? When its main thinker, its founder, its under, frames his ultimate vision for his people's future entirely within the confines and even the expansionist aims of the very state that imprisoned him? That's the profound historical and political paradox that, well, his followers and observers are left to grapple with.